And take it away, Kate.
Great. Thank you, Nick. My name is Kate Chatfield, and I'm the Senior Advisor for Legislation and Policy at the Justice Collaborative. And today we are very, very excited to have with us on this panel um, uh, representatives from Data for Progress, Fair and Just Prosecution, We Got Us Now, and Kings County Prosecuting Attorney Dan Satterberg, and Sean Hopwood from Georgetown Law. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to introduce our panelists. I want to first introduce Sean McElvey from Data for Progress. And Data for Progress is a polling organization. Sean is the co-founder and the executive director. He's guided Data for Progress into a trusted public opinion research organization that has worked with our congressional representatives, senators, presidential candidates, and movement organizations on public opinion and policy design. Sean has spent nearly a decade bringing cutting-edge data analysis and polling to progressive advocacy, and his work has been cited by politicians at the national, state, and local level. His writing has been featured in the New York Times, the Atlantic Monthly, Vox, and the Washington Post. And Sean is frequently quoted in these and other publications on progressive policy and strategy. You can often view Sean these days on many news sites discussing the current presidential primary. Sean Hopwood is an associate professor of law at Georgetown Law. Sean Hopwood's unusual legal journey began prior to him attending law school and included the U.S. Supreme Court granting 2 petitions for certiorari that Sean prepared. Sean pled guilty in 1998 to robbing several banks in Nebraska when he was a young man. Sean was sentenced to 12 years and 3 months in prison, and that was followed by 3 years of supervised release. While there, he became a renowned jailhouse lawyer. Sean was released from federal custody on April 9, 2009. Sean went on to receive his law degree as a Gates Public Service Law Scholar from the University of Washington School of Law. Sean is currently an associate professor of law at Georgetown Law. His research and teaching interests include criminal law and procedure, civil rights, and the constitutional rights of prisoners. We're also very honored to have joining us Ebony Underwood. Ebony is the founder and the CEO of We Got Us Now, the first of its kind. This is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization built by, led by, and for children and young adults of incarcerated parents, who works to ensure that their voices are at the forefront of strategic initiatives, practices, and policies that will help to keep families connected, create fair sentencing, and end mass incarceration. We Got Us Now has recently updated their digital platform and announced their first cohort of actionists from their leadership program. Ebony is the daughter of an incarcerated parent. Her father was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for a drug conspiracy 30 years ago. Ebony was traumatized, understandably, and emotionally devastated by her father's incarceration and silently suffered for years. In 2014, Ebony began to speak publicly and share her story through film, television, and social media advocacy. Ebony is also on the board of directors at the Sentencing Project. She is featured in 2 new books by award-winning leaders in the movement to end mass incarceration, Until We Reckon and The Meaning of Life. She's also involved in the #EndLifeImprisonment campaign. Dan Satterberg is also joining us. Dan has served in the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office for more than 3 decades. He was first elected to lead the office in November of 2007. Dan is committed to improving public safety and the reform of the criminal legal system through partnership with the communities most impacted by crime. His office is a founding partner in the creation of LEAD. This is Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. This is a national model creating a compassionate response to people suffering from substance use disorder and giving law enforcement additional tools for responding to people with addiction and mental health issues. Dan also believes that we need to do more to help people leaving prison and make a successful transition. Therefore, he is the co-chair of the Washington State Reentry Council, and he's also a member of the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission. Dan has been a zealous advocate on behalf of people his office has prosecuted who he believes deserves clemency and resentencing. As of today, Dan has advocated for clemency or resentencing for 27 people serving lengthy prison sentences, most of whom were sentenced after Washington became the first state in the country to enact a 3 strikes law. This was in 1993. To quote Dan, "I always thought there had to be some sweet spot between 15 months and forever." That's how he explained his actions to the appeal. And finally, we're joined by Miriam Krinsky. Miriam is a former federal prosecutor and the founder and executive director of Fair and Just Prosecution. Fair and Just Prosecution brings together newly elected local prosecutors as part of a network of leaders committed to promoting a justice system grounded in fairness, equity, compassion, and fiscal responsibility. These recently elected leaders and the vision they share for safer and healthier communities are supported by FJP's network through ongoing information sharing, research and resource materials, opportunities for on-the-ground learning, in-person convenings, technical assistance, and access to national experts. Last year, FJP convened a group of experts and elected prosecutors at Yale University to discuss this very issue that we're presenting today and the need for changes that address the inequities and the cost, both fiscal as well as personal and communal and familial, of past decades-long sentences. Today, FJP released an issues at a glance brief on revisiting past extreme sentences, sentencing review, and second chances. This brief is what we're going to be talking about today, among other things, and it discusses why prosecutors should embrace sentencing review and second chances and existing mechanisms for addressing extreme sentences. It sets forth detailed recommendations that prosecutors can embrace to proactively address past extreme sentences and advance reforms. Just a few statements or facts before we begin, and I turn it over to our panelists. But as many of you may be aware, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. We imprison people at 5 times the rate of other industrialized nations. We have 2.2 million people currently incarcerated. 2.2 million people currently incarcerated. A recent report by the Sentencing Project revealed that we have more people serving life sentences today in the United States than all people imprisoned in 1970. At the current rate of decarceration, it will take 75 years to cut the United States population rates in half. A key driver of why our prison population remains so large is the subject matter of our meeting here today. It's the use of excessive sentences and the failures to do anything meaningful about them. The poll that has been released, that was taken by Data for Progress, which we'll hear about first, reveals that an overwhelming majority of voters support revisiting sentences longer than 10 years, both through legislation and through actions taken by prosecutors. So with that, I want to turn it over to the representatives from Data for Progress, Sean McElvey.
Thanks for having us. So we're going to run through a quick survey that Data for Progress did from 7th of February to 10th of February, where we surveyed 2,400 likely voters nationally using an online web panel. We weighted that to be representative of likely voters by age, gender, education, the sort of urban, suburban, or rural nature of their geography, their race, and voting history. We found that for nationally represented surveys like this, online web panels match back to the voter file, and weighting using those covariates can be very accurate. And we've had a long track record of accurate electoral polling. So we're really excited to dive in on these issues. So we did two frames. They were split between the different respondents, 50-50. The first frame centered prosecutors, and the second frame centered a sort of legislative pathway. So the wording of the question was that many people are serving decades-long prison sentence imposed under mandatory sentencing and other laws. Around the country, elected prosecutors are creating a process sometimes called sentencing review to examine cases where a person can be safely released from prison and placed on community supervision instead. Do you support or oppose elected prosecutors re-examining past sentences to provide a second chance to people who have been in prison for 10 years or longer and who can be safely returned to the community? In the other framing, we just switched that from prosecutors to legislators. We found that those two framings didn't make a huge difference. Both were positive. With the first one, the prosecutors, there was 67% support, 16% were opposed. That's collapsing the strong and somewhat support. And the legislators, 69% were in support, 18% opposed. In both of those, the percentage of people who were strongly supporting was greater than the percentage of people who were somewhat and strongly opposed combined together. That's what was actually pretty consistent across different demographic groups in partisanship. Obviously, Democrats are more supportive of this, but we're still finding that positive support among independents and Republicans. So this is definitely an issue that could play strongly throughout the country. We then asked respondents a couple of questions about what sorts of arguments in favor of this they find more persuasive. So respondents, half of respondents were asked about a set of factual statements, and half the respondents were asked a set of value statements. So as a representative example, a factual split would simply say that the United States incarcerates more people for longer than any other Western nation. A value split would be something like, all of us deserve an opportunity for a second chance. It tended to be the case that the values splits were more persuasive. But all of these arguments were seen as quite persuasive. I would say that there was a clear preference for arguments that centered the sort of cost of incarceration. The just factual statement that it incarcerates a lot of people and that's very expensive was the argument that was most often ranked extremely or very important. And the value statement that this incarceration was a waste of money was the third most preferred argument with 55%. Other very strong value statements were bringing elderly people back into their communities, which was the second strongest argument, and the idea that everyone deserves a second chance. And then also above average was the deep racial disparities in sentencing. So those are the arguments that people found most persuasive. But again, all of the arguments people said were important. We're just talking about the sort of extent to which that was true. That is all we've got from Data for Progress. We're definitely very excited about this, and I think the thing that's most important, something that we highlight in the report, is that this is an issue that can win over Democrats and can certainly mobilize Democratic voters, but it's also something that people who are more conservative, more moderate, are supportive of. I think we've got more and more evidence coming in through the public opinion polling that people are recognizing the rate of incarceration in the United States to be something that is worth addressing with public policy interventions.
Thank you, Sean. This is Kate. So can you tell me a little bit, or tell us a little bit, how many people, did you poll? And this was across multiple states, correct?
Yep, as I said at the top, we polled 2,400 likely voters across the country.
Thank you. If you have questions for Sean, we'll take them at the end after we hear from all of our panelists. So if you'd like to, you can send your questions through the Zoom link on the chat. So now I'd like to move on to Sean Hopwood, Associate Professor at Georgetown Law, to talk about the context for the importance of sentencing review.
Hey, this is Sean. Thanks for having me. I think we put way too much emphasis on what the judge and our first responders kind of in the criminal justice system can determine about people. I say that as someone who went through sentencing myself, and I work with a lot of people who have come out and had extraordinary success post-prison. And I'll just give a couple examples. One would be Matthew Charles, who served 21 years and is now a fellow with FAM, a nonprofit group here in town. Another one's Alice Marie Johnson, who served, I think, 24 years and who now works for a couple public policy foundations. Both of them have had a lot of success. And just like me, all three of us, our judges thought that we were unredeemable. In fact, my sentencing judge said that when Sean stood up for sentencing and said, he's going to change his life around, you will never see him again, the judge said, I would have bet all the farm and all the animals that Sean wouldn't have made a productive citizen. And what Sean has shown me is that my sentencing instincts, and these are his words, not mine, suck. And the reason is, we just are not very good at predicting who has the power to go to prison and turn it around and who does not. And it's often the case that people have the capacity to change even while they're in this very unforgiving environment. And because of that, we should have more second look opportunities in the law. And it does not surprise me that most Americans are starting to come around to the idea that our sentencing practices are just way too punitive, and that they don't really fix the root causes of why people commit crimes. And it doesn't address what we need to do today and tomorrow to make sure that the people we do send to prison, 95% of whom are going to come back to our community someday, making sure that they come back better off, not worse. So these results are very encouraging to me because, we will use this polling to try and get Congress and state legislatures and governors and presidents to use some of these second look opportunities to find the people. I mean, here's the thing. There are certainly some people that need to be incapacitated for public safety, but there are thousands of people in federal and state prisons who are no danger to anyone if they were let out today. And one of the great ironies of our American criminal justice system is sometimes the longer we hold people in custody, even when they're not a danger, the harder it is for that person to come out and be a law-abiding, successful citizen. It's not hard to figure out why that's so. Our American prisons are really awful. They're violent. people don't come out with better job skills. They don't come out with better social skills. When they do come out after serving a really long sentence, they have very little in the way of family or community support. And so if one wrong thing happens to them once they are out, they have nowhere to turn. And so that's why, we're finally starting to get movement on second look opportunities, whether that's second look legislation, whether that's clemency, or compassionate release.
And Sean, how old were you at the time of your sentencing?
I was 22.
Yeah.
So by the time I was released at 32, and by the time Judge Cuff said that he was wrong about me, I was 38. And so the young man that committed these reckless, foolish things was gone. And we know that people age out of crime, particularly young men, by the time they hit mid-30s, and certainly by the time they hit their 40s. And I always like to say, if we know that people change from their 20s to their 30s and 20s to 40s, why do we think people in prison can't? And if the answer is, well, because they're in prison, then maybe that says something about the system and not necessarily them as individuals.
Right. Thank you. And again, we'll take questions for Sean after we hear from our other speakers. So next, I'd like to turn to Ebony Underwood, the CEO and the founder of We Got Us Now, to talk about what her organization does and how she got into this work.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, just make sure. Thank you again, Kate, and thank you, Fair and Just Prosecution, for convening this and the Justice Collaborative. Thank you all. So I started We Got Us Now back in 2017, merely because as a Soros Justice Fellow, finding out that there was massive amount of children that have been impacted by parental incarceration in the United States, and that they were a historically invisible population. And doing my research, I just realized that mass incarceration had literally become a tsunami that had ripped across the country, devastating communities and ripping apart families. And the children, including myself, of incarcerated parents were the innocent bystanders. And what I mean by that is that there's a generation of children, some now young adults, who are traumatized and who have normalized the inhumane separation and loss of their parents due to draconian sentencing made in this age of mass incarceration. And this excessive sentencing really, from my viewpoint, after just looking at it from the landscape, first of all, from the personal perspective of just having had experiences for so long. At that point, it was 25 years my father had been incarcerated, and I'd never really truly spoken about it. And so just understanding that I was not alone in this experience and that so many others had experienced this, it really made me want to look at who holds the power? My father has been an incredible father. He's never stopped once being a father since he's been incarcerated. Every holiday, every birthday, every graduation for all four of his children, and even into his grandchildren now, he has made a complete effort to be in our lives. And so when you give someone like that life without parole, it just made me want to really dig deeply and understand, where is the point of corrections if this is called a correction system? Where are we helping these people? Where is that rehabilitative assessment made when you give someone life without parole? My father was 33 years old when he was incarcerated, turning 34 3 days later after he was incarcerated. He was convicted 2 years later, and now he's 66 years old. I just saw him this past weekend, and just to watch him age in prison has been, just devastating. And then, I'm looking at this and I'm just thinking about who holds the power. And I realize that prosecutors, they wield so much power in determining the livelihood of these children of incarcerated parents. They literally are the front door to us experiencing this devastating criminal legal system. And when I say that, I mean, it is literally the commoditization of our parents, beginning from the point of excessive sentencing. So when I say that, what that means or what that looks like is, for me, particularly for my family, it's been our tax-paying dollars. I mean, citizens' tax-paying dollars. We're innocent in this. And then to have to, for the past 3 decades, from the cost, from down to proximity, so the cost to actually go to see him, from then having to go through a metal detectors, to then having to, get gas and make sure that you have on the right clothing, because if you don't have on the right clothing, then you may not be able to enter. So if you don't have on the right colors, you are in the middle of anywhere or nowhere, and you have to find a Walmart or whatever in time so that you can actually visit. So all the costs that that you go to get there, and then you may not even be able to actually visit. So, and then once you get into the visiting room, I can hug my father once I see him, and then, have to sit across from him. And, there's so much that I want to share and say, or maybe I want to give him another hug, but, just the way that it's set up, that can happen. So, the emotional and the mental and just the normalizing of that after 30 years really what made me want to fight and speak up, really, and find the rest of this historically invisible population. Because as I began to speak as a social justice fellow, so many people from all walks of life would come up to me and say, "Thank you so much for sharing. I've never had the courage. This is my story too." Black, white, Asian, Spanish, Chinese, everybody from every walk of life wanted to speak about this experience and wanted to share with me, at least, that this was their experience and was pushing me to keep going. And so that's why I started We Got Us Now, because I felt like we needed to identify who this community is, because we're such a huge part of it that people just mostly do not consider when thinking about mass incarceration and its devastating impacts. My father's a grandfather now. He has exceptional institutional record. He has never had any infractions. He is a model prisoner. He has mentored many individuals throughout his prison sentence. Actually, we've created a video called #FreeBillUnderwood, and there are 4 formerly incarcerated men, one of them commutated by President Obama, who all speak to the man that my father is. And, as Sean mentioned, when you give people excessive sentences, a lot of times they don't have any family. In my father's case, he has all his family. We are waiting. We now want him to come home. And it's just so excessive, and it's so heartbreaking to have to continue to just deal with this, not just emotionally, but also just the economic cost is just devastating. And to watch him age in there is just devastating. And so that's why I started this organization, so that I can build a community and we can have a space to share, because that's not ever allotted for these children. Most of the time, they don't have an avenue to share. They are walking around with this pain for decades. And it really doesn't fully show up sometimes until you become a parent, until you become an adult. So that's why we are inclusive of children and young adults, because the focus for a lot of us, we were children, including myself. I was a child when this happened, and now I'm an adult with a child of my own, and I'm still going through this. And now you have this generational trauma where my son and his cousins and, my father's grandchildren are now going through this. So it's not only his pain or his past mistake that he has to pay for, but generationally, we all continue to pay for it.
Thank you. Thank you, Ebony. And I'm going to get back to you with some just follow-up questions after we hear from our 2 other panelists. It's powerful. So now I'd like to turn to a prosecutor. We're 1 prosecutor on this panel from the King County Prosecutor's Office, Dan Satterberg, who's been a leader for prosecutors in this movement to would have addressed extreme sentences for some people that his own office has prosecuted in the past. So Dan, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Ebony. Your voice is very important in this conversation. I'm very excited about the poll numbers here today, and I think that public support for this function is crucial. It shows that the people are ahead of the politicians in this arena, and that it shouldn't be anything for people who are elected officials, whether they're prosecutors or legislators, to fear from taking the initiative to go back and look at old cases. I think the resentencing function is a crucial justice function, and our obligation to do justice, it goes backwards as well as going forwards. It is as important as any other work that we do. And I say that now, having spent, I've been in this office here in Seattle, King County, not Kings, that's Brooklyn. We keep getting their mail, but we're King. I've been here for 35 years, and I practiced before the three strikes law, that was passed by a citizens initiative in the state of Washington in 1993. And so I always struggled with it because it had kind of this one size fits all, and of course one size never fits all. The life without possibility of release, the LWOP sentence, is the three strike sentence, and it was given out for as little as your third second-degree robbery. And in our state, second-degree robbery is a taking by force, not a weapon, not an injury, just like a purse snatching, or you take the beer and punch the clerk. That's a robbery in the second degree. And it used to be that your third one of those under the state sentencing guidelines was a 15 to 20-month prison sentence. And after three strikes, it was forever. It was the slow death penalty of an LWOP. And that never seemed right to me. And that's where it gives some context to the sweet spot between 15 months and forever. But we were giving forever to people that we used to give 15 to 20 months to. And so when I became the elected prosecutor in 2007, that I had to go back and look at those cases that were bothering me so much. And we started to, with the people who had been sentenced to life under the three strikes law in Washington state for three robbery in the second degree cases. There were a number of them. Long since 93, we had stopped seeking a life sentence. There was a debate within the prosecutor's office and within the state association about whether or not the LWOP was mandatory or whether we could seek something else. And over time, we developed a practice where we didn't seek a life sentence for the third robbery too. But that meant that there were a number of men, and they were all men, and they were about 80% men of color, who were in with an LWOP for something that we no longer sought a life sentence for. So in our state, we don't have parole, which means that if the prosecutor doesn't look back, well, nobody will. We have a clemency practice, and I have utilized that, and our governors have been willing to follow my recommendations. And so for 20 of the individuals who had gotten a LWOP under three strikes, I have initiated a clemency review, made sure they had lawyers, and gone to the board and gone to the governor and said, this person has done enough time, justice has been served, and they need to be out. And one of the things that has done is has made the changed, I think, the culture within the prison system. And I visit prisons quite often, and I'm told that people now know that their infraction history matters, that their behavior matters, that their accomplishments while they're in prison will be looked at, even if they've been given an extraordinarily long sentence. The other area that we've looked at, besides three strikes, is to resentence cases where we believe that an excessive sentence was given for whatever reason. Sometimes that's a function of the trial function. It's a function of the year when that happened. But we particularly are looking at non-homicides where people receive sentences of 20 to 25 years or more for a non-homicide. Then something happened with that case that's deserving of our review. So we've had 7 different cases that we've taken back to Superior Court and asked the court to sentence a person to less time than they got back in the 90s because that would be consistent with our current practice, and because it would be recognizing their good works in prison. I actually don't have specific authority to do that. We've been doing it with judges who've been willing to see the justice interest there as well. So right now in the Washington State Legislature, there's a bill that I've been pushing called Senate Bill 6164. It just passed the Senate last week. It's going to have a hearing in the House tomorrow. And I'm going to be sure and share this polling data with legislators to say, really, there's nothing to be afraid of to support a bill like this, which simply makes it clear and explicit that the prosecutor has this authority to petition a court to resentence a case at any time in the interest of justice. And so that is the timing of this poll could not have been better for me, but we're trying to make it clear that we have the authority and, frankly, that we have the obligation to go and do justice on cases that have gone through our office. So with that, I'll be happy to answer questions later, and thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have many questions for you as well, but first I'd like to hear from Miriam Krinsky, who's going to talk about the lead that Fair and Just Prosecution has taken on this issue. So turning it over to Miriam.
Thank you, Kate, and I want to thank Data for Progress and the Justice Collaborative for their wonderful partnership on what is such a timely and vitally important issue. So my lens comes not simply from working with prosecutors like Dan around the country who are looking for a different starting point here and who reject where we were in past decades with sentencing approaches, but also from having been there as a prosecutor in the 80s and 90s. I was, essentially sort of in the eye of that tsunami or storm that Ebony described, where the ramp up was starting to take place and where there was essentially an autopilot among prosecutors who presumed, as did leaders in our community, that a punitive response was the best response, and in many ways it was viewed as the only response in the face of a desire to render communities safer. And what we saw instead, given what we've learned over the past few decades, was that we were doing great harm. We were harming individuals, we were harming taxpayers who were paying and continue to pay for decades of incarceration of individuals who really can be safely returned to our communities. We were harming families, as Ebony has so eloquently explained, and we were harming our communities by creating intergenerational cycles of individuals in and out of our justice system with no real investment or probing inquiry around how do we prevent this cycle? How do we stop the revolving door? How do we take account, as Sean has said and others, of the fact that people do naturally age out of committing crime, and that we shouldn't ever label people unredeemable or forever freeze them in the moment of when they did the worst thing that they've done or made the biggest mistake in their life. So I think we've now seen that there is a wiser way to use the scarce resources of the justice system. And I think we've also seen that not only are these past approaches ones that haven't propelled public safety, but they're also not justice or not a vision of justice that anyone should embrace. That there are many people who are now serving decades-long sentences that are far in excess in any way, shape, or form of what a prosecutor in many parts of the country would consider imposing today. That racial disparities have abounded, that we've had a disproportionate impact and a devastating effect on our communities of color, and that we really are alone in the world in terms of how we've approached this, that we account for 5% of the world's population, but 1 in every 4 individuals incarcerated in the world. And I think it's for all of these reasons that we're now seeing an increasing movement for change, that those individuals who, as Ebony put it, hold the reins of power, prosecutors, are starting to wake up and understand that we have to start doing things differently. And as this poll now tells us, communities support those smarter approaches. We know, and the issue brief that Fair and Just Prosecution put out today has made clear that there is a blueprint for how we change this, that we don't need to keep moving in this direction, that turning a corner is possible. And I think in many ways where we find ourselves today is where we were at the early moments of conviction integrity review. This is a phenomenon, recognizing, as Dan said, that prosecutors need to do justice and dispense justice, not simply prospectively and looking forward, but also in looking back at injustices and mistakes that we've made in the past. This is a moment in terms of sentencing review that is starting to take hold and starting to become a growing recognition among some prosecutors around the country. Prosecutors such as Dan, such as prosecutors in Philadelphia and Brooklyn and San Francisco and elsewhere who are creating sentencing review units or post-conviction justice bureaus or proactively supporting release. It's a moment that's starting to take hold among state legislatures who in various parts of the country now are starting to look at how do we expand and crack open this door that would enable there to be a mechanism for looking back at past excessive sentences that are simply costing us millions of dollars in resources and that are wasting lives and not making our communities any safer. So we do see that these changes are taking hold, and with the benefit of great work that the Justice Collaborative did in putting together a model for what prosecutors can think about in terms of their own policy, a model for what legislators can think about in terms of a new legislative starting point, I really think that we're at a tipping point and that a new normal is starting to take hold. And I think what the poll that's come out today underscores is that the winds of change are at the backs of these prosecutors and can readily blow them through the door of modifying this starting point and this status quo. And that it's not just the right thing to do and something that's smarter and will render individuals and communities in a better place, but as Dan put it well, there's simply nothing to be afraid of by those who are willing to seize this moment of change.
And with that, Miriam, and maybe this is a question for you and Dan, is, Dan, first, let me ask you, is the legislation that you're sponsoring in Washington, is that sort of based on the legislation that was enacted in California that gave prosecutors this power to resentence in the interests of justice?
Exactly, yeah, it's the same idea.
Wonderful. And, one, I am in California, and it was, that legislation was wonderful. It is wonderful. But unfortunately, too few prosecutors in the last 2 years now that it's been enacted have taken advantage of it. Like, what are your suggestions or advice or guidance for breaking through this logjam at the level of county prosecutors to get them to take this role seriously? And I'll leave that to either you or Miriam to answer that.
Well, the prosecutorial instinct is to always oppose anybody who wants to have their sentence looked at, and so the first thing you have to do is to get over that instinct. And for me, like I said, I started with the 3 strikes cases and with the men who had done the least that you could possibly do to get a life sentence, and they were pretty chippy cases, I thought, a lot of them, and when we changed our policy internally and no longer sought those sentences, then that created for me this real gulf and an obligation to go back. We can, just locking people up and throwing away the key, that's not justice either. I think the more that we do this, the more that we make it a normal thing, and we can share the public support for this, that we can take some of that fear away. I went to my county council last year and got another attorney position. So I know I have 2 attorneys and a paralegal who are devoted to looking back at old cases and determining whether we should either support a clemency process or we should try to bring a person back for resentencing. So I think the way that we convince other prosecutors to do it is just to do it and to show that it can be done successfully. And then the individual stories of the people who are impacted, as Ebony mentioned, that is what can also be such a powerful argument of people. There's a diminishing return, right, to a long prison sentence. We don't keep getting, when someone's 80 years old, we don't get much out of keeping them in prison, although it's very expensive. So there's a human story that to be told as well about the people who have made a change, like Sean said. So it's going to have to be a story that we tell ourselves, and that we show that we can survive politically, being willing to go back and question old sentences. But to me, it's been the other thing that is hard to measure, but is absolutely true, is that there's tremendous community support for us doing this from the communities most impacted by crime, because it looks like we care about them as people and not just defending old convictions.
Yeah, and I guess let me maybe briefly add to that. I think this needs a little bit of a reset of what the job of elected prosecutors is about, and that a new way of thinking about what is success in that job. That, this should not be a job that's about, racking up convictions and counting those and counting conviction rates. But it's really a job that first and foremost is about dispensing justice. And justice means not just that forward-looking effort to do what's right, but also correcting the things that we now know were simply wrong and have set us alone in the world. And so, I think resetting the nature of what the job is about and forcing prosecutors to really come to terms with the cost and damage of the status quo. There is a tendency to constantly live in fear of that one case that goes wrong, but we just don't sit around and account for the damage and the consequences of the everyday decisions that prosecutors make that are destroying lives and destroying families and destroying communities. And there needs to be more ownership of that and realization, as this poll underscores, that it's not a matter of politics or ideology or where people are in the country. Across all of those segments, there's support for change, and this is what communities want.
Thank you. Ebony, I have a question for you, I guess, or, at the start of this panel, Sean from Data for Progress was talking about the voters that were polled really connected to the values of second chances and the values of believing and bringing elderly people home. Everyone deserves a second chance. The deep racial disparities, they connected to that and responded to that. And I'd just like to ask you to explain a little bit about your work, maybe, and how and why you bring these stories forward to show the people actually impacted.
Well, the main reason was when I started advocating for my dad. This was during the Obama administration, when he said, he was looking at people that had been sentenced harshly and wanting to look at, if your sentence was brought up today, would you still be incarcerated? The main reason I even decided to speak out was because of that fact that if my father had been incarcerated today, he would not be in prison, but it was the lack of retroactivity in the law that has kept him there. And then secondly, as I began to share and as I began to, just share about my experience, people had not ever considered the families. I was just like, do you not know that to every person that is incarcerated, there are families? I mean, I've crossed this country visiting my dad all over this country. He's been in 9 different institutions. I've seen all sorts of things happen and all sorts of stories. My grandmother, who's now passed, my father's mom, came to visit. She brought me to visit my dad, and she had on open-toe shoes. And they told her no, she could not come in after driving 5 hours to go see my dad. My brother had traveled, who lives in Los Angeles. He traveled across the country and flew to New York City, because that's where I reside. And then we drove down to Lee County, Virginia, to an institution down there that my father was housed in. 18 hours driving after traveling 6 hours across country, then 18 hours driving. My brother, and we're in the mountains of West Virginia. And he has on khaki pants, and they tell him that he cannot go inside. So when you have these situations where, you know, you're encountering, and I've done this for decades now. I'm in the bathroom and women can't get through the wire, the metal detector, because there's wire in their bra, and you see like 5 women in the bathroom cutting the wire out of their bras so that they can visit their family member, be it their cousin or their son or their husband, because they have wire in their bra and they can't get through, or you just traveled 12 to 18 hours, or, you know, the proximity just to get there, to connect with your family. To me, I just wanted to share those stories because it just felt like data. It just felt like numbers. It just felt like these individuals that people were talking about were not human. And I'm like, there's a huge population of people that love and care about these people. And through all of the disparities that we go through, all the different harms that we experience, we still go through it because we love our family like anybody else, regardless of what they have done. And so to me, number one, I didn't want children to feel the stigma or the shame around that. Like, just because you love your parent, it's okay to love your parent, regardless of what they have done. And so that was really important for me to want to be able to just express in the work that I've done. So it started, you know, us creating a video called Hope for Father's Day, as my siblings and I, and we created this video called Hope for Father's Day because we believe whatever day our father comes home would be considered Father's Day. Google had actually saw that video, and they were really impressed by the video, and they too wanted to do something in support of that. So for the last 4 years, we've been in, I'm a content creator and a producer, so we've been in partnership, and what we've done is I've produced 4 different campaigns called, one campaign, but 4 different videos called Love Letters. And Google Love Letters kind of just said, I guess in the criminal legal system world, everybody kind of saw this video and they were really moved. What we did was taking a ode to my story between me and my father. We just showed the unbreakable bond between an incarcerated parent and their child by having children read their love letters to their parents. And then vice versa, you know, since we've done it for 4 years now. The same with parents. Like, I've incorporated parents as well into these stories because I just feel like people should really just understand that for some of us, it's been a long time. For some of us, it's been a short time. But regardless, the loss of a parent is just it can be extremely devastating, mother or father, just really, really extremely devastating. And I just wanted to make sure that the greater public, if you're talking about reforming the system, you have to center the children. When people go to the military, they center the children. When there's a death of a parent, you center the child. When a parent is incarcerated, there is no one thinking about the children.
Yeah. Yep. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for your work. It's incredibly powerful. Sean Hopwood, I have a question for you. And you can talk about your own personal experiences or people that you met while incarcerated. Are there, can you talk about what kinds of resources might have been more helpful or useful for you or people you encountered than, a decade or more in prison?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about federal prison at the time was in 10.5 years of incarceration, I never met one staff member that worked at the prison that ever said the word rehabilitation. And in fact, back then, and I don't think it's largely changed, is there was no pretense of rehabilitating people. It was about warehousing and punishing people. And so, we know kind of some of the things that work with young men specifically who get caught committing crimes, which is, they need job training. They need training on impulse control. They need how to deal with social situations that don't lead to violence. And prison's not the place where they generally get it,
Mm-hmm.
In prison, when there is conflict, there is no such thing as de-escalation. Someone gets in your face and yells and screams, you have to yell and scream louder. If someone starts fighting, you have to fight harder.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that's not a great method for dealing with conflict when you're out of prison. And the whole idea of scream louder, I can tell you, my poor wife, the first 2 years I was out, it was really hard for me to deal with conflict without getting into arguments with her. Now, they weren't yelling and screaming, but they were still, there was not a lot of de-escalation training with me the first couple of years, and it made it very difficult both in my personal and professional relationships to kind of get over the hump. We just need more people in prison teaching people how to deal with things productively, and providing more in the way of training and rehabilitation programming. And then, of course, tying those to the incentives, because a lot of young men specifically, again, need the incentive of early release to kind of get them pushing in the right direction.
Yeah. Thank you. And my question, I think maybe I'll start with Sean McElvey, but it could be anybody could respond really. Were people surprised by the breadth and the depth of support for this?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a strong positive result. Whenever you have an issue that's above 50%, that's notable because, it means that even if all the undecideds move against you, this is still something that's going to have net positive support. And I think it's notable that this is an issue that Republicans are on board with. You often don't see that for progressive policies, particularly in this era of polarized partisan politics. And I'll say that the wording here we used, I think, is neutral and describes accurately the situation. So I think this is a very strong result and a very durable one.
This is Ebony. I would add to say to Sean McElway, thank you so much for creating this poll for Youth Data for Progress, because for a very long time, it has been an emotional roller coaster, just trying to explain or seeking support for people that are in my father's situation, along with my father. And so there's many children that I've encountered that have parents that are in there that are just aging. I mean, the prison system has become almost like a geriatric center. So to literally have a poll and to hear that the public, does believe in this second chance, that just warms my heart. So I just want to tell you thank you.
That means a lot to hear. That's why we do it.
And this is Miriam, and I guess I want to kind of underscore two things that I thought were surprising. Well, again, echoing the thanks to Sean and Data for Progress for doing this. I think it was a little bit surprising as well, not just the extent of the support and the way it cuts across all states and all ideological lines, but that all of the different rationales for why there should be a second chance and a second look polled strongly. I mean, some polled more strongly than others among certain groups, but all of them garnered support across ideologies. And the second thing that I thought was surprising and probably should be notable for those at a legislative level working on change is that both of the polling questions about prosecutorial reform and state reform tethered the reform to giving a second chance for people who have been in prison for more than 10 years. And many of the reforms have looked at a longer period of time as the marker for when the assumption is that the community and others could or would or should support second chances. And this is a pretty broad formulation of the kind of reform that people were being asked about. And even with that 10-year marker, the fact, I think, that it polled as strongly as it did across all ideologies is pretty notable.
Yes, absolutely, and it didn't appear to have, this is Kate, carve-outs for, homicide offenses or violent offenses. It was just, people deserve second chances after a decade in prison, a meaningful opportunity for release. I think that was profound. We're not just talking about, quote, the drug offenses or the quote unquote nonviolent offenses. And with that, it has been an hour, and I would like to thank all of our panelists for joining in on this, and just thank everyone for their work. Thank everyone who's been listening in. And you can definitely look at the Data for Progress and the Fair and Just Prosecution and the Justice Collaborative websites to get the the polling and the executive brief on revisiting past extreme sentences from Fair and Just Prosecution. And I'm sure you can reach out to any of the panelists through their emails, or if you find them online. And you can also, sorry, I didn't mean to neglect the We Got Us Now website as well, to ask them further questions, or perhaps they would be available to give further briefing or to speak with you for any stories that you may want to do on this very, very significant polling. So with that, I'm going to sign off. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.